when I stand up in these sorts of forums, farther away, closer, I speak about issues that are related to my academic supposed expertise, midrash, agadah, chazal, maybe some narrative. But now I stand before you as a Talmud, and I'd like to share with you some somewhat impressionistic reflections that are a result of Rav Lichtenstein's thought and personality knocking around my brain for close to 40 years now, which is pretty crazy, but and which involves a lot of things, a lot of fields and areas of knowledge that are well beyond my professional expertise. I'd like to focus on two aspects of Rav Lichtenstein's thought world and worldview that are, I don't think are given that much attention and are really, I think, quite curious, and to see how they're related and perhaps between those two understand the significance and value of them. The first involves Rav Lichtenstein's interests beyond the Beit Midrash, intellectual interests beyond the Beit Midrash, and of course his general interest and love of English literature, particularly poetry, and command of what used to be called the Western literary canon is well known and something that Rav Lichtenstein himself reflected on. But there's another, perhaps less discussed and I think less well-known subcategory or different category, which is that he had this personal canon of British writers, thinkers, and critics, some of whom were also great poets, but that wasn't the point, who were very central to him, beginning once again in the Renaissance with his beloved Milton, Henry Moore, about when he wrote his doctoral dissertation, in the 19th century, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and the Romantics, with the Victorians, Cardinal Newman, Matthew Arnold, getting into the 20th century, T.S. and C.S., T.S. Eliot, C.S. Lewis, and finally, his doctor, father, and mentor, Douglas Bush, the only one who wasn't technically British, but I get the sense that he really was. And I think as a group, we can group these thinkers together and several others as part of what we call an Anglo-Christian humanist tradition, whose roots, once again, go back to this religious Renaissance humanism out of which it all springs. And the extent of his admiration, and I think he would be okay with the term influence, of these non-Jewish religious Christian thinkers on a rabbinic figure of this sort is really quite remarkable and requires some reflection and might even give us pause. On the other hand, we have his attitude towards the two great speculative traditions of the Middle Ages, the Kabbalah and medieval rationalism, rational philosophy, most associated with the Rambam. Now, regarding Kabbalah, I think the most important evidence we have is silence. And at least in my experience, there are people who know more than me, but he just didn't quote Kabbalistic works at all, just about, even works like the Nefesh Chaim, which are central to the Litvish tradition, which he was 100% a part of, nor even Kabbalistically inflected works like the Maharal, or certainly not Hasidus, or Rav Kook, who really was a fellow traveler on so many issues, or Pachad Yitzchak by his own Rebbe. And I don't know of any real evidence, I've heard people say in positive terms, of any great knowledge or command of this sort of literature. The only positive information I have about this is something I heard from Rabbi Eli Weber, the director of the overseas program in the yeshiva, regarding the one semi-Kabbalistic work that Rav Lichtenstein definitely studied and knew extremely well, that is the Ramban al Torah. And Eli Weber is also a big fan. He gives a regular shiur on Ramban al Torah, and he said that he once asked Rav Lichtenstein how to deal with the passages al derech ha'emet, right? The clearly, openly Kabbalistic passages in the Ramban al Torah. And Rav Lichtenstein said, those things aren't for people like you and me. Now, this sort of approach, which I might categorize broadly as ein lanu esek b'nistarot, which I've seen in other people who came from the same general background, is something that, in my experience, is a double-edged sword. It allows a person to, on one hand, show great reverence and respect for the Kabbalistic tradition as a central part of Judaism. On the other hand, it allows the person to not necessarily engage with ideas and texts that they don't identify with and maybe feel uncomfortable with. And that includes texts that were never esoteric and were always meant for the masses, but have some Kabbalistic influence in them. So that's on one side. Now, in terms of medieval rationalism, Rav Lichtenstein was extremely knowledgeable in this entire tradition and in the much wider Western philosophic tradition of which medieval Jewish rationalism is an integral part. But his attitude towards this can be summed up, I think, by his comments for Sabato that in Vache Panecha, that if the Moreh Nevuchim were somehow be lost, it would be a loss, but not a great loss. Now, this is an amazing statement to make about a book that people, including the people he was closest with, believe was one of the most important books written in Jewish history, if not in all of human history, right? It's really shocking. And I saw this when he gave his Friday Hashkafa Shiurim one year on the Moreh Nevuchim. Of course, the rest of the guys, he didn't volunteer that. And you saw his just lack of identification, even discomfort with the book constantly. And this is part, I think, of a much broader lack of interest in the central concerns of the Western philosophical tradition in its more technical sense, writ large, from Plato and Aristotle through Kant and on to the present day. And we see this clearly in the beginning of his essay on Torat Emet and Torat Chesed, where he says, while the meaning of the former, Emet, is presumably quite clear, except that insofar as the concept of truth generally constitutes a philosophic and particularly epistemological morass, the latter is richly ambiguous, right? Chesed, right? So ethics, we can translate chesed that way, is like a great poem in the eyes of the new critics, richly ambiguous. But philosophy, the great questions of epistemology, I think, and I would say also for metaphysics and ontology and all those things, are either just self-evident or just so complicated that they're just not worth really getting involved with. It's not worth the time almost to untangle all this stuff. And we see this also in terms of relationships with the Ravs, Kantian interests, I don't think he terribly responded to either. And now this is particularly curious because of his relationship with the two greatest figures of these two traditions. We already mentioned the Ramban al Torah. He called that his desert island book. If you could only have one book in the world, that was it. And on the other side, I think there's no question that on the short list would have been the Mishnah Torah. So he has a very strange relationship to these figures. And if we take these two things together, we have a really striking, on the surface, disturbing picture of a figure who kicked out from under himself the two great pillars of medieval thought, medieval Jewish thought, and kept himself afloat by grasping on to a group of early modern and modern Christian thinkers. How do we understand this? It's someone who's clearly a completely traditionalist Orthodox thinker. Now, the only place where I know that Rav Lichtenstein deals with his issues, as it were, with the Rishonim, Kabbalists and rationalists alike, is in an essay that both Chaim and Avi also mentioned, of marriage, relationships, and relations. And there, as we've heard, he focuses on the apparent dissonance between the impression conveyed by Chazal and the Rishonim regarding the issue of marriage and sexuality. No Freudians here, I hope. Okay. And as he says, we already heard, the Rishonim, Kabbalists and rationalists alike, have a negative image towards sexuality and marriage, whereas Chazal have a much more positive relationship to this. And as he emphasized, this is consistent with what he sees as our modern Jewish approach to the issue, and is consistent with a modern worldview. I think that this gap reflects a much deeper gap between Chazal and the Rishonim. Daniel Boyarin argues in Carnal Israel that what makes the reason why Chazal have a so much more positive attitude towards sexuality than their rough contemporaries, the Hellenistic Jewish thinkers like Philo and the early Christians, is because they lack a strong, clear split between body and soul, which for these other thinkers, because of their roots in classical Greek philosophy, have very strongly. And this split goes deeper because Tanakh also, I think Tanakh is very important for Lichtenstein and Chazal, have almost no interest in any sort of systematic philosophical inquiry, questions of metaphysics or high theology. It's just not their concern. Chazal and Tanakh are far more interested in human behavior and experience, obviously through both halakha and ethics, and the mortal's relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, but not with the nature of the Godhead in and of itself. And this is the main thing that separates Chazal from medieval Judaism. What forms medieval Judaism as we know it is the encounter right after the close of the Talmud of the rabbinic world with the great Greek tradition, as both of them are merged together in an Arabic-speaking Islamicate environment. And obviously this is what creates medieval Jewish thought, medieval Jewish philosophy, but as far as Kabbalah is concerned, I don't know expert in this, and I don't think anyone really knows the details. Kabbalah is also a systematic attempt to give a metaphysical account of the universe and of God, and it bears a lot of similarities to various strains of Neoplatonism. And in that sense, these all come together as coming out of this encounter, which Chazal are insulated from, I would argue. I don't think they really know a whole lot about this. Now, Rav Lichtenstein notes the possibility of such outside influences on the Rishonim. And he says, in the end of that article, the allure of facile historic solutions in our case of ascription to Sufi or scholastic influences regarding worldliness, a much broader term in general, or sexuality in particular, is palpably self-evident. In dealing with giants, however, we strive to avoid succumbing to its alluring temptations. But Lichtenstein doesn't actually reject the notion that these figures were influenced by Greek philosophy or their successors. Christianity, yes. He says at the end of the same paragraph, no one questions Aristotle's impact on the Rambam or Kierkegaard's according to the Rav. No, Kierkegaard, not Hermann Cohen. He's just rejecting simplistic historicist views that see great thinkers as purely products of their environment and time, and that's good historiography, regardless of the fact that Lichtenstein's clearly coming with a religious agenda here. And as I said before, he doesn't really resolve this matter of how this actually works and how the Rishonim make such a radical break. But that's where he concludes. Now, I think his reference to scholasticism gives us a hint to the role of the Renaissance in this whole question. Because the Renaissance humanists were fundamentally or largely described as responding to and rejecting the medieval scholastics who Lichtenstein has placed as parallel to, at the very least, the thought of the Rishonim, the philosophical metaphysical Rishonim. And as a guide to the Renaissance, which I, unlike like others, I have no expertise in, I'd like to take the figure of William Bousma, the preeminent intellectual historian of the Renaissance, who taught at Berkeley in the second half of the 20th century. I came upon his work by an accident. Without getting into details, I think he's important not just because of his preeminence, but because he was a slightly older contemporary of Rav Lichtenstein, a product of Harvard, and I think they come very clearly from the intellectual world. It might be the closest we can get to how Rav Lichtenstein viewed the Renaissance, viewed whole. And Bousma argues that the idea that Renaissance humanism represents a return to these classical Greek sources that were not known in the Middle Ages, he thinks is not terribly accurate. He thinks that what's much more important is a return to very specific, relatively late, and actually late antique sources that actually were known in the Middle Ages, but weren't of interest to them. And he places together what he sees as two poles, two foci of the ellipsis, as Lichtenstein would say, of Renaissance thought, which together create a tension and a totality. And that is, on the one hand, Stoicism, and the other hand, Augustinianism, followers of the writing of St. Augustine. And he says together they differentiate themselves from the Middle Ages in their lack of systematic thinking, and in their this worldly focus on the social, the political, and the ethical. They also create a tension between them, between the Stoic transcendent, distant God and the more intimate, immanent Augustinian God. The Stoic focus on the rational faculties, whereas the Augustinian focus on the whole person and human experience, which Bousma explicitly links to a breakdown in the body-soul split in the Renaissance, and therefore a more positive view towards sexuality, which of course continues through Western thought straight on to today. Now, all of these points, Renaissance resonate deeply with Tanakh and Chazal on the one hand, and Rav Lichtenstein on the other. Rav Lichtenstein was clearly deeply influenced by Augustine, quotes him all the time, supposedly even recommended the Confessions as a Musar Sefer. And on the other hand, Augustine, for all his various influences, was a person deeply engaged with the Hebrew Bible, he calls the Old Testament, and certainly one of its greatest interpreters of all time. On the other hand, the Stoics, their ethics have been noted by numerous scholars to be quite parallel to the ethics of Chazal, as they appear certainly in Pirkei Avot. Their complete lack of metaphysics, though it comes from a different place, also works well with Chazal, and Rav Lichtenstein, as mentioned, quotes various Latin Stoics with some frequency. So what does this leave us with? I think what we see now is that Rav Lichtenstein's engagement with Anglo-Christian humanism especially in Renaissance humanists and their ancient predecessors, gave Rav Lichtenstein the tools and a framework to sidestep the main currents of medieval Jewish thought and to construct a worldview which he felt more accurately represented the thought of Chazal and Tanakh. But having constructed this neo-rabbinic worldview, he was then able to go back to those same Rishonim and recoup from them those elements which he thought were most appropriate and were most authentic, as it were, to Chazal. In terms of the Ramban, by sort of tuning out the Kabbalistic music, he hears what Elliot Wolfson would call the rabbinic melody, the midrashic melody in the Ramban, and gets a text which is deeply involved in the text of the Bible and in the midrashic interpretation of it, with broad thematic conceptual approaches and particularly an ethical framework. In terms of the Rambam, once you cut the Mishnah Torah free from its metaphysical moorings, what you get is a vision that is so Rav Lichtenstein. I mean, you'd think that he wrote it, right? This a profound universalistic moral vision for the individual, society, and polity, which is supported by a complete commitment to the one true God who always remains completely distant and other, ganz anderes, as Rav Lichtenstein would have thought of it. And with the Rav, he leads behind the Rav's Kohenian neo-Kantianism, neo-Maimonideanism, and embraces his Kierkegaardian existentialism. So Rav Lichtenstein was seeking out are through lines that link together all of Jewish thought into a single synthetic unity, so that he can fashion for himself a coherent tradition that in fact works in the modern world. But he was only able to accomplish this with a little help from his friends in the classical and Christian traditions.